The Chinese have come into our capital markets with as many as 5,000 companies without any particular screening, oversight, due diligence. You have companies that are, for example, equipping concentration camps, companies that are responsible for manufacturing China's most advanced weapon systems. The last two aircraft carriers come to mind, hypersonic glide vehicles, new generations of ICBMs targeting American families, new sixth-generation fighter aircraft. We're funding, in some ways, our own demise.
Tens of millions of Americans are funding problematic Chinese companies, often without even knowing.
These aren't individual names that you can see on a list of your holdings. When you get into the index funds, into this kind of world, then you are lost.
During the Reagan administration, Roger Robinson served as Senior Director of International Economic Affairs at the National Security Council, where he played a linchpin role in Reagan's economic strategy against the Soviet Union. He's the co-founder of the Prague Security Studies Institute.
Nazi Germany. We were buying the sovereign bonds of the Third Reich like crazy. This is a matter of record. Isn't this eerily similar? Do we buy Chinese sovereign bonds where the cash goes directly into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party? Yes, every year.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Roger Robinson, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you, Jan.
Roger, you believe you've discovered what's arguably the largest financial scandal in the history of the world. Now, that may sound a bit melodramatic, but it's big. What is it that you're seeing?
Well, Jan, it's hard to know exactly where it fits in the pantheon of scandals precisely, but I can tell you this. You don't, to my knowledge, have an occasion where there's the multi-trillion-dollar underwriting by a democracy of a totalitarian police state bent on its destruction and way of life, that's aided and abetted by, in our case, Wall Street firms, wittingly or unwittingly, and U.S. government regulators that are sadly, conflicted because of the revolving door with Wall Street.
You're saying, in a nutshell, that huge amounts of money are coming from the American people into communist China, day after day, right now, to the tune of trillions of dollars.
Yes, that trillions of dollars, of course, is over time. This has been going on, Jan, sadly, for at least 25 years. And the Chinese have come into our capital markets with as many as 5,000 companies. The exact number isn't known because the government hasn't volunteered any data on this. But our best understanding from research is, again, some 5,000 Chinese companies. Now, the disturbing part, Jan, is that those companies came in without any particular screening, oversight, due diligence, and in a regulatory regime. They were not looked at carefully to see, for example, are they already sanctioned by the United States for egregious national security and human rights violations? The answer to that is no. And so we don't have, as we do in the trade portfolio, for example, a Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that's certainly imperfect, but at least it makes an effort to vet Chinese efforts to buy into the United States, whether it's American companies, farmland, whatever. There's at least some mechanism to try to get a handle on that. It's never had its parallel in the U.S. capital markets. The same is true, sadly, of private equity funds. I can't speak to exactly the process they go through, but certainly publicly traded companies, these are to be scrutinized. We have investor protection issues. The Securities and Exchange Commission, our Department of Treasury, even the White House National Economic Council should be caring about where the American people's money's going and how it's being used. What kind of companies are we talking about here? Well, we asked that question over the research of a number of years now, and the answer is troubling. You have companies that are, for example, equipping concentration camps, trafficking in slave labor, aiding and abetting genocide in Xinjiang, building out the surveillance state of the country. And on the national security side of the equation, you've got companies that are responsible for manufacturing China's most advanced weapon systems. The last two aircraft carriers come to mind, hypersonic glide vehicles, new generations of ICBMs targeting American families, new sixth-generation fighter aircraft. In other words, all of the areas that you'd be concerned about militarily are in no small part being underwritten and funded by how many? Perhaps 75 to 100 million of us in the international side of our investment portfolios. Most people have diversified portfolios. They have some, perhaps, international exposure. For those of us that do, I can tell you that the chances of our being in possession in our portfolios of some of these bad actor Chinese companies is extremely high. It's near a certainty. So think about the fact that this is not some esoteric issue here. This isn't, we're not talking about space-based missile defense here, or something that is more distant from the American people. This is their money, and they have no clue as to the fact that it's being sluiced into some of the most horrific abuses in the world today via Chinese state-controlled, they're all state-controlled entities. The CCP has a lock on every Chinese commercial entity. We must know this by now. So the idea of a private sector is not happening in China. So the state can call on these companies to engage in strategic and even military activities, intelligence gathering, for example, at their whim, as we well know. Article 7 of the National Intelligence Law spells this out, and a number of other pieces of legislation. The Chinese aren't hiding it. So here we are. We're not getting the protections we need. We're not getting the transparency and disclosure we need. And certainly we're not learning that we're funding, in some ways, our own demise.
And that's not even talking about the fact that, for example, these companies, Chinese companies that are listed on U.S. market are listed via this very spurious investment vehicle, VIE, right? And that they don't even need to provide a reasonable audit. And this is something that really kind of blows my mind, because there's deep auditing, by the Big Four that every listed company needs to be subjected to. Whereas here, for some reason, Chinese companies get a pass.
Well, indeed, they receive preferential treatment. I mean, this took place in a May 2013 memorandum of understanding between the then Obama-Biden administration and the Chinese Securities Regulatory Commission, whereby we waived the requirement for a U.S. government audit of their auditing companies. Well, every country in the world is subject to this kind of audit by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, the so-called PCAOB, which is under the Securities and Exchange Commission. Every American company is obligated to be subject to such an audit. There's only one country in the world that has ever received a waiver, an exemption, and that country of all countries is China. So just imagine the free lunch program that represents from a regulatory point of view. That's why we have so many sanctioned Chinese companies that are littering the portfolios of the investment products that the American people are holding. Emerging market exchange-traded funds. That sounds exotic, but these are just so-called index funds. Index is a list of companies. It might even be 1,000 companies long. And index providers like MSCI, FTSE Russell, Dow S&P build these lists, including on the international side. Again, emerging markets comes to mind because it's quite popular. Well, guess who's the bulk of the emerging market countries? China. And so you have a circumstance here where the American people are holding these index funds as their preferred investment vehicle, or their financial advisors, stockbrokers, fund managers put them into these things. And they are holding, in fact, a number of these Chinese bad actor companies that is, in a sense, hidden from view. These aren't individual names that you can see on a list of your holdings, like you'll see Microsoft, you'll see NVIDIA, you'll see all kinds of names, but you're not going to find sanctioned Chinese bad actors there so much. It happens. But when you get into the index funds, into this kind of world, then you are lost, because it is a part of the scandal is the non-transparency of it that's embodied here. And of course, you mentioned the variable interest entities. We can get to that when you want to, but I can tell you that that is a remarkable case of, in effect, a kind of fraud itself. Again, you have to call it scandalous. Some 95% of the Chinese companies that are traded on the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange, what about if the American people understood that they don't own one share of these Chinese companies? They're all registered in the Cayman Islands. A front company is established. It has a contract that is supposedly infused with the value of Alibaba, for example. But do we own actual shares of Alibaba, which many Americans do? Millions and tens of millions do. No.
Or they think they do.
They think they own shares, but they own shares of a contract of a front company set up in the Cayman Islands that's supposed to substitute for real shares. This isn't something where you need enhanced disclosure to learn more about the VIEs. The VIEs themselves are a scandal and need to be terminated immediately. So we could spend a lot of time going through case by case. And the more you look at it, and the more categories you look at it, you'll see the same kind of story.
Roger, one quick sec. We're going to take a break. And folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Roger Robinson, former senior National Security Council official in the Reagan White House. Recently, President Trump signed the America First Investment Memorandum, which seems to go after some of this. Can you just lay that out for me a little bit?
Yes, I think that this is one of the most important historic events in this period of the president's new time in office, new term. It is a remarkably important document because it's the first time that the United States has committed to what's called outbound investment screening, particularly of a security-minded variety. Now, outbound, we know what inbound investment is. It's the Chinese trying to buy stuff here and secrete themselves into our system, steal our technology, buy that farmland near our military installations, that kind of thing. And it's, of course, terribly important, technology theft being central to that mission. But outbound investment hasn't seen the light of day from a national security perspective, whereby we're focused on Chinese military companies operating in the United States. And they should be Chinese military companies, period. Any Chinese company with ties to the PLA should be, People's Liberation Army, should be barred from the U.S. capital markets and our private equity markets. It should be illegal for Americans to hold their stocks and bonds or those of their subsidiaries. That's what should be the case. And the president is moving in that direction. It states that we will use all means legally available to us to stop U.S. investors from funding Chinese military industrial companies or that sector. Going back, I've been looking at these questions for, sadly, 45 years or so, and I can tell you that when it comes to a security-minded lens, looking at money flows from the United States to our principal adversaries, even the Soviet Union, and before that, before my time, Nazi Germany, where we were buying the sovereign bonds of the Third Reich like crazy. We were investing in the Krupps and the AG Farbens and the Nazi military machine. This is a matter of record. We played no small part in funding that war machine of the Third Reich. Well, what did we learn there? I mean, isn't this eerily similar to what I'm talking about now? Do we buy Chinese sovereign bonds where the cash goes directly into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party? Yes, every year. Are they led by American banks? Yes. Are we involved right now with 4 of our largest financial institutions, as I sit here, that are lead managing or in lead manager roles of an initial public offering of the Chinese battery giant CATL, C-A-T-L, out of the Hong Kong exchange, $7.7 billion. How is it okay that America's largest financial institutions are trying to are lead managing such an offering that's ultimately going to have the shares of CATL, which will then be H shares, meaning Hong Kong shares, will move right into those index funds. And here we are, yet another Chinese PLA-tied company adding to the portfolio of the American people. So I know the problem with this is it sounds, it can get a little bit complicated, and it's easy for the eyes to glaze over and say, wait a minute, global finance is not my thing. Well, I got a message for the American people and our allies elsewhere. It is your thing, and it's your thing because it's your money. Well, it is. I mean, if we take a look at China writ large.
So, as we finish up, I think this is a great place because, you're watching this show, you might be outraged at the level of exposure that you have because of your money being invested in these various Chinese companies. What can you actually do right now?
Call your stockbroker, call your fund manager, call your pension system administrator, call your financial advisor, whoever it is that manages your money. Ask the following question. How many Chinese companies do I own shares in? And here's the key. There's 2 types of holdings of these companies. One is called actively managed. That's when you buy CATL or buy AVIC or buy China General Nuclear Company, and there's the name on your list. You buy that as an individual company, like a Microsoft, like a NVIDIA, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can get an answer to that. But where you're going to be potentially deceived is they're going to come back and say, well, you don't own any Chinese companies, or you own these 3. And then your question is, you're talking about actively managed, aren't you? Individually purchased, right? They'll say yes. And you'll say, how many Chinese companies are in my exchange-traded fund? How many are in my emerging market fund? How many are in index funds in general that I own? And the person you're talking to is going to say, beats me. I don't know. Well, is it knowable? Oh yeah. It's just a lot of work because there might be 1,000 companies on that end. He or she doesn't want to go through that list to find out, what but if they say, look, we saw lots of Chinese companies in your index funds. Say, well, okay, I want an index fund that is ex-China and ex-Hong Kong. Or I want a national security index exchange-traded fund that excises the bad actors if you still want some China exposure. You say one of those two things. Either get me out of China or get me out of China bad guys, and don't tell me that I don't own Chinese companies when I do, because you're too lazy to look at the index funds or not knowledgeable enough to know the dirty little truth here, which is that's where they reside, that's where they are, and that's what you're not telling me. That's what I would say to the American people.
So, Roger, it sounds like you want to start a movement here.
Well, I think it's extraordinary that scores of millions of us unwittingly are funding some of the most egregious national security and human rights violations that we can conjure up, that will surely lead to the death of our men and women in uniform, that will surely lead to the torture and destruction of human beings in Xinjiang and elsewhere. We have been let down by our financial managers of all stripes. We have been let down by U.S. government regulators at the Treasury, the SEC, the National Economic Council. We have been let down by the committees of jurisdiction on Capitol Hill that are supposed to provide this oversight, the House Financial Services Committee, the Senate Banking Committee. This is a tragedy, and this is the scandal that, going full circle to the beginning of our discussion, this is why the term scandal is used, and these we've talked about are some of the dimensions of that scandal.
Well, Roger Robinson, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Roger Robinson and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.